All right, let's dive into one of the most famous and, frankly, most unsettling experiments in the history of psychology. This is a study that peeled back a layer of human nature and revealed something really profound and, honestly, pretty disturbing.
You know, it all really comes down to this one single haunting question. Are good people capable of doing terrible things? I mean, could you, a decent moral person, be pushed to do something awful just because someone in a position of authority told you to do it?
So, back in the early 1960s, a psychologist at Yale named Stanley Milgram was just haunted by this idea. He was thinking about the Holocaust and couldn't wrap his head around how millions of ordinary citizens could participate in such horrific acts. He wondered, was it just a few bad apples, or is there something inside all of us, a potential for darkness that's just waiting for the right situation? He decided he had to find out, and he designed one of the most famous experiments ever to try and get an answer.
Now, Milgram was smart. He knew you couldn't just walk up to someone and ask, hey, would you obey in order to hurt someone? Of course not. He had to create a situation, a really convincing illusion. So he put out an ad looking for volunteers for a completely ordinary study on memory. No one had any idea what they were really walking into.
Okay, so picture this. The experiment is set up at Yale. Each time they run it, there are 3 people in the room. You've got the experimenter, this serious-looking guy in a gray lab coat who was actually just a biology teacher. Then there's the learner, a friendly 47-year-old guy who was, get this, an actor. And finally, the teacher. And this is the key part. The teacher was the only person in the room who was a real, genuine, unsuspecting participant.
To make it seem legit, they had the participant and the actor draw roles from a hat, to see who would be the teacher and who would be the learner. But the whole thing was rigged. Both slips of paper in the hat said teacher. So our unsuspecting volunteer always ended up in the teacher's seat, the one who had to deliver the punishment and face a huge moral test. And at the center of all this was the machine, a big, intimidating shock generator. It had a long line of 30 switches, each one bumping the voltage up by 15 volts. The label started out innocent enough, slight shock, but they quickly climbed all the way up to danger, severe shock. And then, at the very end, the last 2 switches were just labeled with a terrifying XXX. Now, the machine was totally fake, but man, it looked and sounded completely real.
And just to sell the whole thing, to make sure the teacher really believed it, they gave them a sample shock, a real 45-volt jolt. It wasn't much, but it did the trick. It proved that, yeah, this machine is real, and the pain it delivers is absolutely real.
All right, so the stage is set. The test begins. It's a simple memory game, right? The teacher reads a list of word pairs. The learner, who's in the next room, has to recall them. But here's the twist. For every single wrong answer, the teacher is told to flip a switch and deliver an electric shock. And with each mistake, they have to move 1 level higher on that scary-looking generator.
And as those voltages start to climb, the actor playing the learners starts to react. Well, it's all pre-recorded, but the teacher doesn't know that. First, there are little grunts of pain. Then, those grunts turn into shouts. By the time they hit 180 volts, he's yelling, actually screaming that he can't stand the pain and he wants out of the experiment. And this is where the real test begins. Not the memory test, but the test of obedience. The participants, the teachers, started getting incredibly distressed. The original notes described them sweating, trembling, stuttering. Some even broke into this weird, nervous laughter. One person actually had a seizure. But whenever they looked over to the experimenter for help, maybe to stop, the guy in the lab coat would just calmly and firmly tell them to continue, using a specific set of commands. He had these 4 scripted prods he would use. It started off gently, like, please continue. But if the teacher still hesitated, the pressure ramped up. The experiment requires that you continue. Then, it is absolutely essential that you continue. And finally, the ultimate command. You have no other choice, you must go on. It was a systematic, methodical application of pressure. Things get really intense at 300 volts. The yelling from the other room stops. Instead, there's a desperate pounding on the wall. And then, just complete silence. Nothing. No more answers, no more screams, no more protests. What does the experimenter say? He tells the teacher to treat the silence as a wrong answer and to keep flipping the switches. So what happens now? You have a person in the next room who might be seriously hurt or worse. They're totally silent. And you have this authority figure in a lab coat telling you that you must go on. What do people do?
Well, the results were just staggering. Way, way worse than anyone could have possibly imagined. Before he even started, Milgram actually asked a bunch of psychology students and his colleagues at Yale for a prediction. He asked them, what percentage of people do you think will go all the way to 450 volts? And they predicted, maybe only the most sadistic, cruel fringe would do it. Their guess? Less than 3%. So, what percentage do you think actually did it? The answer? 65%. Let that sink in for a second. 65%. Nearly 2/3 of the participants, these were ordinary people like you and me, obeyed the experimenter and went all the way to the end, delivering the full 450-volt shock to someone who wasn't even responding anymore. And if you look at the data here, you can see just how powerful that pressure to obey really was. Check this out. Not a single person stopped before 300 volts. Every single participant went at least that far. And while a few did drop out after the pounding on the wall started, the vast majority, 26 out of the 40 people in this original study, went all the way to the end. So that brings us to the biggest, most important question of all, right? Why? Why on earth did so many regular people obey orders that so clearly went against their own conscience? Well, Milgram's main explanation for this is something he called the agentic state. It's this mental shift that happens where a person stops seeing themselves as responsible for their own actions. They kind of hand over their free will. They become an agent, just an instrument carrying out someone else's orders. In fact, when the participants would ask, hey, who's responsible if something happens to that guy, the experimenter would just say, I am responsible. And for so many people, that was it. That was all the reassurance they needed to just pass the buck and keep going. But it wasn't just that one psychological trick, it was the whole situation. Think about it. This was all happening at Yale, a super prestigious university. The person given the orders was wearing an authoritative lab coat. The participants genuinely believed they were helping advance science, a worthy cause. And maybe most important of all, it was a slippery slope. The increase in shock was so gradual. Going from 15 volts to 30 volts doesn't feel like a big deal. It's that slow step-by-step escalation that really trapped people. The legacy of this experiment is really complicated. On the one hand, it showed us a terrifying truth about obedience and authority. But on the other hand, the cost was high. The deception, the incredible stress it put the participants through, it caused a massive ethical debate. And that debate completely changed the rules for how psychological research is done. And it's a conversation that's still happening today. And that brings it all right back to us, doesn't it? It's so easy to sit here and think, oh, I would never do that. I would have stopped. But what Milgram's work powerfully suggests is that the line between who we think we are and what we'll do under pressure from authority, well, that line is a lot thinner and a lot blurrier than any of us want to believe. So the real question to leave you with is this. Under the right circumstances, what orders would you follow?